I can see that we have all of the participants and attendees are now in the main webinar room. So I'd formally like to welcome you to this evening's webinar. Thank you for taking the time to join this session. This evening, we are joined by Helen Mormon, CEO of AMMF, John Bridgewater from the UCL Cancer Institute of London, Andrea Sheardown, who is a CCA patient and patient advocate and moderator of the AMMF discussion boards, and Andy Clay, also patient advocate and AMMF discussion forum moderator. My name is Gary Nolan, and I will be helping facilitate this evening's webinar. So before we go into the webinar itself, I would just like to ask our panelists to introduce themselves. And I'd like to start off by welcoming Helen and asking Helen to briefly introduce herself.
Thank you very much, Gary. Well, I'm Helen Morment. I'm CEO at AMMF, the cholangiocarcinoma charity. We're based here in the UK. We are actually the world's first and remain the UK's only cholangiocarcinoma charity dedicated solely to that cancer. We've been established for 22 years now. We work nationally across Europe, and we collaborate globally. Our sole focus is on cholangiocarcinoma and improving the current situation and the future situation for all those with this cancer. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you all here this evening to this webinar, Navigating Clinical Trials, and especially delighted to have a distinguished oncologist, Professor John Bridgewater, with us to speak about this tonight. So please take every opportunity to pick his brains. They are enormous, so he's got plenty of information to share with you. I'm also really delighted to have Andy and Andrea with us. They are absolutely phenomenal supporters of the charity and do amazing work behind the scenes, and especially on our discussion forums, where their steady hand and their advice is absolutely invaluable. So thank you very much, and I very much welcome. So look forward to seeing all your questions as we go through this evening.
Thank you, Helen. John?
Thanks very much, Helen and John, for inviting Helen and Gary for inviting me. John Bridgewater. I'm a medical oncologist. I work at UCL. And I've done some medical trials together with my colleagues around the country and the world in cholangiocarcinoma. Thanks very much for inviting me. And I apologies in advance. I've got a bit of a cold, so sound a bit nasal. Apologies.
You sound wonderful, John. Thank you. Andrea.
Hi, I'm Andrea Sheardown. I'm a patient advocate. I've battled cholangiocarcinoma myself, still here 9 years later, and obviously now dedicate a lot of my time to raising awareness of this cancer. And I'm sure a few of you here today have seen my name on the forums as well. So I'm looking forward to learning more about the trials. I've never been on a clinical trial, so tonight's very important to myself as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. And Andy?
Hi, I'm Andy Clay. I was first diagnosed with cholangiocarcinoma. My anniversary is coming up for 7 years. I've had quite an interesting journey. I've had Whipple surgery as I was extrahepatic, chemotherapy, and I was fortunate to be able to go on a trial as well. And very honoured to be here this evening.
Thank you, Andy, and thank you to the other panelists. So this evening's webinar is titled Navigating Clinical Trials, Trial Terminology and Key Questions to Ask Your Healthcare Team. So that is going to be the topic of discussion today. The format of this evening, over the next hour, we've just completed our welcome and introductions. But first, we're going to hear from John Bridgewater, who's going to provide a presentation outlining clinical trials and what they are and some of those critical questions that should be or could be asked to your healthcare team. We're then going to move into a moderated discussion where Andrea and Andy will be putting questions to John Bridgewater following his presentation. And at this point, I'll keep reminding you, there's a feature within the Zoom webinar where you can pose questions to the panelists throughout. So I encourage you throughout the presentation, throughout part 2, which is a discussion between John, Andrea and Andy, to keep putting your questions in, and we will come to them at some point. Once we've done this, we'll move on to part 3, which is an open Q&A session. This is where it's all about hearing from you. And this is where Helen and John will be available to answer all of your questions. To get a question answered, you must put it into the Q&A feature. Otherwise, we are unable to respond to it. So moving on, just a couple of housekeeping rules. As I mentioned, this is a Q&A webinar, so we're going to hear from John and our panelists, and then we would be going around and responding to your questions. So please use the Q&A feature to ask your questions. The second part is, if you do have any technical issues, please use the chat and write to my colleagues, and we will do our best to respond to you. And then lastly, this session is being recorded, but it's only being recorded to ensure that those that can't attend are able to access the session and the answers that are delivered. In terms of the objectives, it is all about providing you, patients and carers and loved ones, with an insight into clinical trials and empowering you to be able to have better informed conversations with your healthcare team. In terms of this session itself, it is a pilot. It's hopefully the first of many webinar sessions that AMF delivers. This being the first one, we're excited to hear feedback on that. So please put anything into the Q&A around your thoughts, and we'll likely follow up with further questions on your experience. But this is the first of hopefully several. And what's really important is interaction and engagement. We do have some we have set aside time in this webinar to hear from you and have your questions answered. So please do put your questions into the chat function. So with that being said, I'd like to swiftly move us on to part 1 and welcome Professor John Bridgewater, who is going to deliver a 15 to 20 minute presentation on clinical trials. So John.
Thanks very much, Gary. So this is about, first the sort of ABC of clinical trials. So we're constantly trying to figure out how to take care of our patients better. That's just something that we do, and the way to do that best of all is in a clinical trial. In the old days, you never had clinical trials. You just did things and see what happened. And really that doesn't actually fully test, doesn't, as they tell us in school, it isn't really a fair test of the new thing that you're trying to do. And so really the trial is a test of a new intervention. Doesn't need to be medicine. It could be some kind of surgery. It could be some kind of imaging. It could be some kind of test or other. It's a test of doing something different, and the idea is to see whether that improves the outcome for you, our very precious patients. So and there are some of these. You can get trials of different types. You can get trials where you are preventative trials, for instance, where you're stopping something from happening. So there's a big trial associated with cholangiocarcinoma patients. The PSC primary sclerosing cholangitis study, which is being run through the Cancer Research UK by one of our close associates, Shahid Khan, at the moment, and that's preventing the progress of both CSC and cholangiocarcinoma with aspirin. And so that's a preventative study that's up and running at the moment. But more commonly, we have trials that look at treatments, and you can either be in a trial that just gives you the treatment, the new treatment, and then the trial has to be specially designed so that it gives you the answer as to how good it is, or you can be in a trial where it's randomized, and I'll come on to that. I'll come on to that in a second. But the whole idea is to figure out whether something is actually better than what you're doing now, because that's what we want to do. Next slide, please, Gary. So prevention trials like the aspirin trial, screening trials. So these are trials where we're looking where, for instance, people have a number of scans to see whether they're going to develop a condition, or a number of blood tests to see whether they're developing a condition. That's something that you can do. Or, of course, treatment trials. Those are the ones that we're probably most familiar with in cancer treatment. Next slide, please, Gary. And so this is a critical bit, really. How do you decide whether a treatment is good enough? And so there are 4 phases, generally speaking, 4 phases. Some people say mostly 3, but you start with phase 1, which is essentially a safety study. So you have this fabulous new treatment that you've designed, or you've gotten. I mean, you can get new treatments these days in many ways. You can do some big studies in laboratories that tell you whether something is going to work or not. These days, you can use AI to determine whether some things are going to work or not. And indeed, some of the new drugs coming along, that's exactly what's been happening. Completely not what you would expect. Things you wouldn't expect to be of any value turn out to be really, really interesting. And it's only through AI that's told us that. So increasingly, you find new things, and we've been finding lots of new things recently. And the first thing to and it goes through what we call in vitro and in vivo experiments on in petri dishes, and probably in some animals. Really limited. Those experiments are very, very limited these days. And then it gets tested in people. So phase 1 really is the early phase where these new treatments are tested in people to see whether it's safe. And most of the time, these studies are done extremely well and extremely carefully. But it's really important to design your phase 1 study very carefully, so that the drug is fully tested for safety. It has to be said, for the most part, the treatments we have these days are much, much safer than what they used to be. So I do doubt whether anything similar to chemotherapy, many of you may be familiar with chemotherapy. I do doubt whether a chemotherapy would ever make it through a phase 1 study these days, because it has so many side effects. The new drugs that we have really have far fewer side effects, and generally speaking are much kinder. I think that's right. But the phase 1 is really where you find out whether something is safe, and what happens is the dose of the drug goes up as you run through, as you recruit patients to it. And at a small group, 10 to 100 is a bit much. Normally they're less than 20 phase 1 studies, and you find your right dose in your first 20 patients. And then at the end of that, you say, right, this is the dose with which we're going to go to phase 2. So phase 2 is where you have a slightly bigger group of patients. Actually, I'd say 300 is a huge phase 2 study, really. I'd say normally phase 2 studies are 100 patients or less these days. And that's really trying to find out whether it actually works. You'll get some clues from your phase 1 whether it works, but phase 2 is when you're really trying to find out whether something works or not. And So in that situation, you have to measure how well it works. That's normally with scans. There are other ways of measuring how well it works with blood tests, or simply how the patients are doing. That's a really good way of telling whether something is working or not. So that gives you a clue as to how good it is. Whether it's any good, how good it is. And I've been involved in studies where we've tested things that are fantastic. I've been in studies where we've tested things that really weren't so good. And so the phase 2 study really is in terms of a new compound, is the go, no go point. Is it any good? Isn't it any good? Then you move on to phase 3. So phase 3 is where you test that potentially good drug against what you would normally use. So so normally this is sort of treatment A, and you compare it to treatment A plus B, something like that. And the way you do that comparison is normally through something called randomization. Randomization has its supporters, has its detractors. It's so you sign up for the study, and you either and then you tick all the boxes to go into the clinical study, and the process is that the randomization process is normally done by a computer somewhere, and it allocates you to either have the standard treatment, which is what you'd have got anyway, or the new stuff. Many times I've been told by Helen and lots of other people, people hate being on the standard arm. People want the new stuff. And that's completely understandable why they would do that. But sometimes you have to have, this is the only way of having the proper comparison to tell us whether something works or not. And those really are the big, headline studies. Those are the studies we all love to present in big conferences, because they really change what we do. They change the standard of care from A to A plus B, and that's really where it makes a big difference. Phase 4, you don't get too many of those anymore. They're just they tend actually these days to be simply studies where you're introducing the compound to a greater population. There's a huge amount of safety data by then. You don't have too many phase 4 studies anymore. So that's that lot. Next slide, please, Gary. So here's some words, and I'll try and take you through these words. So the protocol is the Bible from which the study runs. So you should be able to tell from the protocol exactly what to do. You should be able to find it, look it up. In the old days, when we used to have, when we used to get inspected by agencies, that I'm not sure whether we'd touch on it, but if you do enough clinical trials, eventually some of the regulatory agencies will come and inspect you to see whether you're doing it all right. And this is like a guy who comes and sifts through every little bit of paperwork, seeing whether you've ticked all the right boxes and you've done all the right things and the right bit of information is everywhere. Can be an incredibly stressful process. And they used to look for a protocol, a hand protocol that's well thumbed. They loved the well thumbed protocol. That means that while you're doing the trial, you are constantly referring to your protocol, which is the Bible that runs this trial. It tells you exactly how to do it, and what to do in pretty much every conceivable situation. And a well-written protocol is actually a very good thing to work with. Informed consent. So this. So whenever anything happens, pretty much anything happens to patients these days, we have to consent them to the process. So this means that we have to explain doctors, nurses, people running the study have to explain to the patient what the trial is, what the options are, what the risks and the benefits are. And this is really, really important, that people know that when you sign up for a study, it is a bit of a risk. You might be in the phase 2 study, for instance, when you don't know how well something works, well, you could be signing up for something that doesn't work very well and has got lots of side effects. So you need to know that, and the patient needs to be completely clear about why they're taking the risk of taking that study. Phase 3 study is much less of a risk because the standard treatment is part of it. The risk in the phase 3 study is curiously the A plus B bit. So not the A bit, which is the standard treatment, but the A plus B. So we don't know whether the addition of the new stuff, we hope it's going to be better, but we don't know whether the addition of new stuff is going to be better, or it could actually be more harmful in terms of its side effects. Very rarely is it harmful in terms of what it does to the patients, but the greater risk is the increased side effects of the A plus B combination. Placebos are much loved by the regulators, the MHRA in this country and the FDA in the States. These are the regulatory agencies who tell us whether we can, after a trial, whether we can use a drug or not. These are so if in a study it's A versus A plus B, you take everybody gets A plus something. Some people get A plus placebo, which is nothing, and some people get A plus the real stuff. And the reason that you have a placebo study is to just be absolutely make the impact of your novel treatment completely impartial. What do I mean by that? Yeah, I mean that if for instance I have a study and I know that my patient is getting 2 drugs and not 1, and my patient gets a side effect, I'm more likely to go, oh my goodness, it's probably because of the new stuff. Actually, if the patient is taking placebo, I wouldn't know that. I wouldn't be able to tell that. And so that's just a cleaner, fairer test. Some people find it difficult to accept, and I completely understand why, but it's just a cleaner, fairer test. Randomization I've already described. We have to have it because that's the cleanest scientific way of divvying up treatments between one group to be able to fairly compare it to the other group. You can't leave out it, and it has to be done by a computer or something like that. It used to be done by cards in a box. That's a long time ago. We don't do that anymore. That was somewhat unreliable. The least reliable way of doing it was asking doctors to do it. They were completely hopeless at doing this, and so they should not be allowed to choose what treatment somebody gets. And then blinding is where you're using a placebo. Basically, you don't know whether you don't know whether A plus B. You don't know whether B is active or not active. That's what blinding means. Happy to go through any of those explanations again if anybody wants in due course. Next slide, please, Gary. So how do you get on a trial? Well, first of all, you have to find it, and maybe we'll talk about that. You have to find a trial that's suitable for you, and then you should be sent an information sheet about the trial, and then you'll turn up. And they'll get you to sign the initial consent to allow them to allow the trial team to start doing tests on you to see if you tick the boxes. And that's called the screening phase. And that varies in duration, normally about a week, sometimes 2 weeks. If it's complicated and you have to send off for some further tests, it may be 3 weeks, or it varies on the trial. Then then if you pass the screening test, you're enrolled. So you get on the study, and you either, depending on what phase of study it is, 1, 2, or 3, you'll get the stuff, or you'll get randomized and receive whatever treatment the randomization tells you. And then through the treatment, patients on clinical studies are monitored much more closely than if you just had standard treatment, like everybody else, monitored much more closely, because we really need to capture every piece of information possible about the new treatment that you're giving. Increasingly, studies are now really the monitoring is really very intensive, because both pharma companies and indeed academic studies, the move these days is to get as much information from as few patients as possible. And so really the monitoring is really very intensive. And then there's follow-up. So at some stage you'll come off the treatment. Maybe you will, maybe you won't, but in a lot of studies you come off the treatment, and then you're kept an eye on with regular surveillance and scans. That's normally the way we do it. Next slide, please, Gary. So randomization, I've been through a bit. I've been through this bit. It's really a way of making sure that patients are equally allocated to arm A, which is the standard arm, and the experimental arm. For the sake of this discussion, let's call it A plus B. And so that's the only fair way of doing it. As I say, pretty much every way is unreliable, and it introduces bias into the study. And it's normally done using a computer. Next slide, please, Gary. So what do you need to ask? I like this slide. What do you ask your doctor or your trials nurse when you turn up, thinking you might sign up for the trial? So first of all, you have to make sure you tick the boxes to see that you're suitable for the trial, and the criteria these days are pretty stringent. They get increasingly stringent. Some people say they're too stringent because if it excludes too many people, then what's the point? It's not something for everybody. But there are fairly rational reasons why people need to tick the boxes to get into a study. So ask your trial person about that, and whether you fit, whether you're likely to tick the boxes. Sometimes even before you start, it's clear that you don't tick the boxes. What does it involve? The traveling, the time involved coming to clinic, treatment duration, what does it do for trial impact? So, does it mean I can't have the standard treatment as well? That's a very important question. And then the alternative: what happens if I don't go for the trial? That's really critical. That's really critical. Gary, please. So finding trials is not as clean cut a process as we'd like it to be. There is no central list, because keeping such a list would be a huge undertaking. There are many, many trials. Some trials are found on standard clinical databases, AMMF website. Trial databases, clinicaltrials.gov is one, but even clinicaltrials.gov gives you a long list of trials which are not, for which most people don't qualify, and it tends to be actually quite badly out of date. The NIHR have a website, and there are other ways of doing it. Most of the time, talking to your doctor is the best way to do it. Gary, please.
Thank you, John.
Hey.
So, just making sure I'm muted. So, thank you, John. What we'd like to now do is invite both Andrea and
Can I butt in
Andy.
on you? Sorry, because I'd like to just ask before we go on to the next section, there's just one or two things I'd like to sort of raise with Professor Bridgewater. And that is to an extent the inclusion of patient advocates in the setup of trials. And I think this is vitally important to know, for all of us to know, that these days patient advocates are quite often involved in the design of a trial. So when a trial is being set up and put together, patient advocates will be asked, what do you think about this step? What do you think about, would patients be prepared to go through this to get on the trial, or to go through this because we need to get this data? So that's really important. And if you say no, because actually that's too onerous, you're asking patients, for example, to stay in overnight. That's very difficult, to be away from your family. Try and get the tests that you need done in other ways. And that's the trial designers are usually quite receptive to that. And also trial management groups. A trial doesn't just start and happen in isolation. We have trial management groups. While the trial is ongoing, there's quite tight management over all the locations. What adverse events might have happened? Is it actually causing a lot of toxicities? What's going wrong? What's happening? So there's a lot of monitoring of clinical trials as they're ongoing, and also input by patient advocates. And patient advocates these days are also usually members of the trial management group too. So this doesn't happen away from how the patients might want things to be. Patients are very much included now in that area. Thank you.
Thanks, Helen. Thank you. I didn't mention that. It's incredibly important. The role of advocacy in designing trials now. We've involved you, Helen, in most of the recent trials in this disease area, and almost inevitably there's a really positive outcome of that. And yeah, that's really important to know. And it's what we get wrong. Why do we need patient advocates? Because we're not the patient. That's why. So when I design a study, I don't know what it feels like to be a patient. Okay, I don't go through the emotional roller coaster. I'm not under the same incredible stress that some people are. I don't understand that, and I need to understand that to make my trial work. So I've found that change, that relatively recent change. Helen, you'd say what, 5 years, 10 years, something like that?
It's been growing, but it's really completely accepted now, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah.
I remember, as you say, many times when we've sat down, particularly for something on the ABC-10 trial, when I've said to you, no, you can't do that.
Yeah.
And oh, why not? And then you've accepted it, and things have changed.
Well, you were right. And so yeah, that's a really, really good example. Better in some places on the planet than others. Europeans don't really haven't got their head around it yet. They will soon.
I would like to ask, if it's okay, John.
Sure.
Obviously, being on the patient forums, both in the UK and in other countries, we quite often learn about trials that are going on in another part of the world versus the trials here. And, is there plan to try and collaborate more globally with a centralized list? I know that there are a couple of very savvy people in our groups that have recently designed some amazing spreadsheets that captured basically the clinical trials that are happening across the globe now. They've used AI in the background, and people can upload their molecular profiling to the site, and it would sort of throw out to them where the trials are for that particular mutation they may have, and some could be this country or the States. But would there be plans to look further into that with a view of making these more accessible?
Yeah, very, very, very good question. So the difficulty, several approaches to that. The difficulty with a list is keeping it up to date. And most lists of trials I've seen are, as a rule, hopelessly out of date. At least half the trials are closed, or they're put on pause, or something like that. So it's really that's the main problem with a list. Having said that, this business of putting your molecular profile into a program and then it spits out, oh yes, you can do this, that, and the other. I think that's an incredibly good idea, and so those trials really move beyond a cholangiocarcinoma. You could have any kind of cancer for that, and so that in that way, you don't just restrict yourself to cholangiocarcinoma studies. You have you have access to pretty much all what we call tumor agnostic studies. So if you have, for instance, I mean there are lots of them. If you have, for instance, an IDH2 gene, and there'll be one of these coming along. If you have an IDH2 gene, you can plug in IDH2 and it will tell you, there's an IDH2, and you don't study in Liverpool or something like that, and you don't have to have cholangiocarcinoma to do it. You can have an IDH2 gene from any kind of cancer, and there are a number of these. So there's two things. There's two sort of broad groups there. Studies for cholangiocarcinoma alone, and then what we call tumor agnostic studies, where you just have to have the molecular abnormality. And so, to try and answer your question, Andrea, is there a list? No, there isn't a list. The difficulty with a single list is actually keeping it up to date, because it would be the full-time job of quite a few people to do that. And so currently, I think it's still somewhat a lottery as to whether you get onto something and how you get onto something, and that's clearly not, could be better.
Thank you.
John, perhaps I could extend on that a little bit.
Yeah.
In terms of if somebody's been treated at a regional hospital, not specialized particularly, your oncologist may be GI across pancreatic, cholangio, liver. They probably are too busy to be up to date with all the trials that may be being recruited for. Is there anything that a patient can do to facilitate that process, in terms of anything they can do to sort of push to get onto a trial? I mean, again, typically the most recent ones are you'd have to do some form of molecular profiling to know what you could target, but that's not necessarily a standard that is offered right off the bat, and you'd normally have to go through a first line of treatment before you even could qualify for the trial.
Yep. So thank you, Andy. So you're absolutely right. Not everybody out there knows about all the trials, and really it's up to the patient to ask. These guys, they're busy. They don't know about clinical studies. They will not. I mean, I don't know all the studies that are available for everybody the whole time. I have a reasonable idea, but I definitely don't know all of them. And so you wouldn't expect somebody who doesn't do research in any way at all to know that. So if you want to take the next step, do something a bit more, then you have to ask. You have to say, refer me, send me to these places. I've found on the AMMF website that Bridgewater's doing this, that, or the other. Refer me. And so you do have to take some kind of positive action to get there. It's not something that will happen at the moment. Today, 2024, it will not happen automatically.
Thank you.
Professor Bridgewater, this question came from one of the forums earlier. Basically, it says, are you anticipating any non-targeted trials in the not too distant future, or are they going to continue to focus in the UK on trials for further new treatments for the more common mutations, FG, FR, HER2 and IDH1?
Yeah, brilliant question. So the reason that these targeted studies where you're just targeting one genomic abnormality, the reason they're around and they're so popular, and the drug companies want to, really want to fund them and push them, is because they tend to work better. You're targeting just one gene, and if you normally you're targeting just one gene, could be any one of them, and if you shut it down, it normally works really quite well. Much better than chemotherapy and other standard ways of treating something. And so that's where all the excitement is. In fact, I was at a talk with Peter Johnson, who's the chief, I forget what he is. Anyway, he's responsible for NHS cancer, I think, and he was saying that is where the pharma companies are placing the vast majority of their funds. So they're putting a huge amount of effort into developing new targets, new targeted therapies. There are more and more of them coming along. Is the only thing I'd say about that. So yes, there are common mutations, but we're about to get now the 5th generation of the FGFR2 drugs coming through. There are new drugs coming through for new targets the whole time, and it's really important that you get your, I mean, we've spoken about this before, you get your profile. Never let go of it, because at some stage something that seemed irrelevant a while ago suddenly comes into focus. So get your full profile, clasp it to your chest, and keep it close with you, because even though it's a no today, it could be a yes tomorrow.
Thank you.
So I think we have time for one more question, Andy, if you have a question, or Helen.
Yeah, I think perhaps what sort of timeline could people expect from a trial from being on phase 2 till when it actually gets approved by NICE?
Some time, I'm afraid. It sort of depends how good it is. So, for instance, some of the drugs that some of the targeted therapies that Andrea mentioned just now, the FGFR2s, were so good that they didn't need to have a phase 3 study. So they just went from a phase 2 straight to NICE, and then and then were approved. Even so, the process of finishing the phase 2 study, not having to do the phase 3 study, which normally takes several years, but just phase 2 study to NICE approval was at least a couple of years, and NICE approval to being available is it's about 6 months now for some of them. So it does still, I'm afraid, take too long, in my view, way too long. It's got to do with the regulation, and I could talk for some days about that. Maybe not now.
And perhaps just a little bit more on that, because we touched on the international backdrop for trials. If something's already been trialed and tested and FDA approved in the US, for example, does that shorten the timeline that a drug would be available in the UK, and what are the hoops that you have to jump through, given the work that's already been done?
So that's a resource thing, really. It takes these drug companies a lot of time and money to put the drugs through regulation. It's the MHRA and NICE in the UK. It's the EMEA in Europe. It's the FDA in the United States. It takes them a lot of time to do that. They all tend to do the FDA first. To be fair, the FDA have have a record of doing what they call early approvals. So they see something's promising and they approve it, but you have to do another test of some type to that. The AMA does not do that. NICE does not do that. So it varies, I'm afraid. There's not a level playing field out there for getting these things approved.
But the work that's done,
it drives me potty somewhat, but there it is.
But does the work that's already been done in another country carry any weight when that drug's then trialed in the UK?
Oh yes, no. I mean, if there's good trial evidence, it's good trial evidence wherever it is. It's actually slightly more fussy the other way. So if you've done a good trial in the United States, no, in Europe, the US people have to come and inspect the sites in Europe to check that it's good. So that's right.
Thank you.
Gary, there are a whole load of questions.
We're going to come to those now. So I'm just going to move us on to our next discussion, and this is an opportunity for us to respond to some of those questions that have come through in the chat, and Andrea and Andy will help pose those questions to you. So I'd like to welcome Helen to.
Thank you, Gary. I was just going to jump in quickly because just before we go to the questions that have come in the chat, I've got a few things I'd like to talk to John about before we move forward. We know now how absolutely vital molecular profiling is to our patients with cholangiocarcinoma. But since the approval of pemigatinib, which was first targeted therapy, molecular profiling is available under the NHS, but only to those who've already gone through a first-line treatment. Now, if they've got a mutation, a fusion, or what have you, they've got it. So why do they have to go through a first-line treatment and wait until they've suffered all sorts of toxicities, or it's failed, or they've got recurrence for their molecular profiling? That's number one. You probably don't have an answer for that. But would you therefore suggest, thinking about everything we've talked about so far, that everybody diagnosed with cholangiocarcinoma should find a way to get their molecular profiling straight away, even if it means they have to pay for it? And what, if they are paying for it, what should they be looking for in the company that they go to? You know, they want a broad as possible profiling. And this is a question we get asked a lot.
Yeah. Okay. So the first one first about the targeted therapies before chemotherapy. So you have to, in that, chemotherapy and immunotherapy is what we call the first line treatment, and we know that works. And so you'd have to prove that the targeted therapy was better. You need a randomized trial where some people got the targeted therapy and some people got the standard treatment. You need a randomized trial to prove it was better before you could do that. Now, there are some of them out there at the moment. There's some of the HER2 drugs. There's going to be two of them for the HER2 drugs coming up. The difficulty with running such studies is getting the test back. And currently, as part of the NHS, you don't get the test back for. That's the main. There are other issues, but the primary issue that you don't get the test back for 4 to 6 weeks, and so some people wait 4 to 6 weeks for their profile to come back and to see whether they can go on one of these drugs. But for most people, it's too long to wait. To put it another way, the clinical trial that we did have trying to do that really didn't recruit at all, because essentially people didn't want to wait. With respect to the testing, that's absolutely critical. Not all tests are made equal. Currently, some of the best testing is done in the genomic hubs, the NHS genomic hubs. But the downside of that is that you don't get all the results from your profile. You only get the results that the NHS funds the genomic hubs to produce. So at the moment, actually, it's just been increased to about five or six targets that they will release to you. You don't get the whole result, which you would if you paid for it. The other side of the coin is that some of the tests that you pay for are actually less good than the ones that you would get as part of the genomic hub profiling. So it's not. There's no simple answer to that one, I'm afraid, Helen.
It's a lottery then.
Tiny bit, and but the current recommendation in pretty much every guideline that I've had anything to do with is that we should get that profile as early as possible. Early as possible.
Yes, yes. And if I may, just one other quick thing, because you mentioned Peter Johnson, who is
yes.
Yeah, I'm sure I'm a thorn in his side as well as many others. But we had the big gallery study here in the UK, and it was using the GRAIL blood test, which identifies ctDNA, circulating tumor DNA, in the bloodstream, and it can be at very, very early stages. Now, the sensitivity of the GRAIL trial actually identifies the 3 types of cholangiocarcinoma reasonably clearly. In fact, cholangio is up in the top 20 of the cancers that can be identified by GRAIL. In fact, maybe even up in the top 10. But when I've spoken to there's a couple of things about this. Under the gallery study, which was completely random, several people with cholangiocarcinoma were identified, and I think 1 or 2 actually managed to get to Mr. Hassan Malik in Liverpool and have had surgery. So that's pretty excellent. I would really like to see this GRAIL blood test investigated further, so it's a screening tool for people with cholangiocarcinoma. GRAIL, I've spoken to the GRAIL people. Can we get the test for our individual patients? No, they can't do that. But Peter Johnson is absolutely no way are we looking at this as a screening tool. But to my mind, how does this fit with the NHS idea of getting 75% of cancers diagnosed at an early stage if you haven't got a screening test? So I just know next time you're speaking to your friend Professor Johnson, can you tell him that we want the GRAIL test, we want the gallery test as a screening tool for our cholangio patients?
I know what he's going to say to me. He's going to say it's too expensive to use for everybody without any symptoms. It may be possible for a high-risk group. So a group of people who, for one reason or another, for instance, the PSC patients, the cholangitis patients, it may be cost effective to do it in high risk groups, but in everybody, it's just way too much.
Well, I think they are areas that should be explored now as we move forward. We are seeing enormous, comparatively speaking, enormous increases in the incidence of cholangiocarcinoma. It is the equal of hepatocellular carcinoma, but nothing doesn't get half the share of the attention or the care. And we're now getting a lot of people coming to us who have family involvement. And we've always thought this is not something that runs in families. Now, we don't know if it's something hereditary. It could be environmental toxins. But where people are coming to us and they are panicked for themselves, the rest of their family, for their children, and there is something that maybe could put their minds at rest, I just feel that we should be exploring this.
Gary, should we do some of the questions
I
in the chat?
really want to draw us to some of the questions in the chat. I'm going to jump straight in. One of the questions that's come in is, do certain cancer units specialize in cholangiocarcinoma? John.
So that's, again, a really good question. So there's no specification as yet of places that do specialize. There are places that see a lot of patients with cholangio and have some experience with it, and that's fine. But is there is there again a list of tick boxes that make you a specialization place? Not at the moment. AMMF has got a project working on that.
Thank you. Another question that has come through. Let me see, where has it gone? So where's it gone? It's essentially is it solely the responsibility of the patient to identify clinical trials, or can a healthcare professional do that as well?
Yeah. So the patient, is it the responsibility? If it's nobody's responsibility as such. If the patient wants to go for a trial, you should say, I want to go for a trial, and then it's actually up to your healthcare person to try and do their best and put you in touch with people who would know, or somebody who would know somebody who would know. You know, it's once again, there's and all healthcare professionals are encouraged to do research, but research takes time, research takes energy, and it's, you know, and it's not probably something that they would normally do, and so in some places there would be a bit of a barrier to it for those reasons. And you know, for me, that is incredibly regrettable. But I think that's probably true.
Professor Bridgewater, just following on from earlier when we were on about a list and appreciating how it would be hard to keep one going. Obviously, a couple of the comments that have come in are alluding to, it's called genomic focus, and it's designed by a patient that had perihilar cholangiocarcinoma in America. He's always been very good with spreadsheets and things, but they've designed a AI system that connects to various clinical trials, one of them being clinicaltrials.gov. So it's constantly the program to keep it all update and constantly add the trials into that pot. And that's what a lot of patients here and in other countries have started to upload their test results to. So that was just following on from, so that is in existence at the moment.
So that sounds pretty good. That sounds probably the closest you're going to get to it. Clinicaltrials.gov is way out of date. It is the only thing I would say.
It's not the only one that it's feeding
into,
but it's just that is in the background at the moment.
No, absolutely go for it. By all means, completely 100% supportive of that. My only warning would be that actually clinicaltrials.gov is can be quite badly out of date.
Thank you.
One other question, and this one actually for Helen, is can patients and patient advocacy groups improve the access to clinical trials?
Well, I think if patients come across a clinical trial, certainly if they can come in on our discussion forum or let us know about it, we would investigate and share on our clinical trials area on the website. I mean, clinical trials have a horrible habit of opening and closing quite quickly. Sometimes there are very few locations where it's open, and depending on the phase of the trial, they may be looking for very few people. Sometimes they are multi-disease trials, maybe looking at a particular mutation, and therefore they might say, well, you know, we're looking for 100 people, but actually we only want 5 with cholangio, and that gets filled enormously quickly. So again, there are difficulties, but yes, as a patient organisation, we try to keep a good eye out. We rely on our healthcare professionals to tell us, and we're very much in touch with all the pharmaceutical companies who are working in this area, and they let us know about their trials as well. And we try and keep abreast of all those. But yes, for sure, if patients let us know what they're coming across, that's absolutely fine. And we are. You know, we also have been in meetings with the guys from Genomic Focus, and it's always that it's very new, And for us as a patient group, it's very difficult for us, we might individually think that looks great, but as an organization, we have to be careful that we're not pushing people down this, who are already in a difficult situation, down this road of this endless roller coaster of unrealistic hopes. So I don't think this is an unrealistic path to go, but we have to make sure that it's accurate and good before we actually say to people, do this, use this. It's free. I guess there's nothing much to lose. So
yeah, one last question, John, just to finish this up. Can you get molecular profiling after chemotherapy or whilst on immunotherapy?
So that's a really good question. It's way less good once you're on chemo, because chemo will, in most people, actually clear the circulating cancer cells from your bloodstream, and so there's nothing to measure. So if at all possible, have your and also chemo will make any new biopsy material, the pathologists call it very degenerate. It tends to make the cells less good. So if you're going to have any kind of biopsy, be it a liquid biopsy or a tissue biopsy, it's best to have been off chemo for at least a little while. Immunotherapy is fine, so you can be say off chemo for 3 months on immunotherapy, that's fine. The pathologists prefer 6 months. 3 months is almost not enough.
Thank you, John. I'm mindful of time and the questions that are still unanswered. So what I would like to propose we do is there are several questions that we just don't have time to get onto, is that we take a note of all these questions and we find a way to get the answers back out to everyone for those that were asked and unanswered. So with that being said, I'd like to thank you all for taking the time this evening to engage in this discussion with our panelists. And to close us out, I would just like to hand back to Helen.
Thank you, Gary. I think this has been really fascinating. I wish it had been 2 hours, because there are questions that I can see in the question and answer group that I really want to get onto. So we will do our best to get back to them. I'd like to thank Andrea and Andy for being courageous enough to put themselves forward to be doing this this evening. That's been great. And thank you, John. I mean, I know you have such a heavy workload these days. Thank you so much for coming in and giving of your time so generously. Thank you, of course, to our sponsors who have made this possible, AstraZeneca and Taiho, who are working tirelessly to find better therapies for us. And thanks to all the team, the AMMF team, who have helped moderate us and get us going tonight. And I'd really like to hear your comments, maybe come in on our chat groups. Would you like more of these webinars? Because we're happy to do them if it's what you want. Thank you, everyone.